And I want to be fair. People's stories change. People's memories falter, right? Like it's very hard to get people's accounts of things. But if you're using that story or those stories to then convict people of murder, you got to say, are these stories dependable? Are these witnesses dependable? And what we found is they weren't.
Quincy Cross is in prison for the murder of Jessica Currin. In August of 2000, Jessica's body was discovered behind a middle school in Mayfield, Kentucky. Her clothes were ripped. She was bruised, beaten, and her body burned. For years, it looked like this case would go unsolved, until a woman named Susan Galbreath started digging around. Susan had an unlikely connection to this case. She said that God had instructed her to solve Jessica's murder. And while she followed God's plan, the police began following Susan's lead. From the beginning, all Susan could focus on was Quincy Cross. Eventually, police set their sights on 4 other people as well. But after listening to the new podcast Graves County, you really start to doubt almost everything anyone says about this case. Because despite Susan saying that she was on a mission from God, this case may actually be built on a testimony of lies. Maggie Freeling and Rebecca Ibarra are the host and producers of Graves County. I'm Kathleen Goldhar, and this is Crime Story. Maggie and Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First, I have to say that this was one of the best podcasts I've heard in a very long time. It was so tight, so good. I was listening going, these people know how to put a podcast together.
We appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It wasn't at all difficult to write or make, and we didn't suffer through this at all. So
I'm sure you didn't, and we can talk about why we delayed even starting the podcast in public, because I'm sure that went to that. But let's start with the thing that started it off, which is the death of this poor young woman. So can you tell me about how and why this whole thing started?
Yeah, so Jessica Currin was a 18-year-old new mother. She just had her son Zion, and she had just really went out on her own. She just got an apartment. She was starting her life. She was young, vivacious, had the world at her fingertips, and she turns up dead, how you explained, in August of 2000. And from the beginning, the case was a disaster. From the crime scene, a rookie detective was assigned the case, and he says to this day he thinks that was intentional, so the case was not solved. So it was a mess from the start.
What a horrible thing to know going in, Rebecca. What do we know about how this sort of unexperienced, not ready police officer screwed things up from the very beginning?
So we're talking about a cop who was a beat cop. His name is Tim Fortner. And he's admitted that he was inexperienced. This isn't us commenting on it. He's on the record saying. So Fortner had just been promoted to detective that summer. So this was his first case, and it was a murder case. And just for context, this was the first murder in Mayfield in over a year. So it wasn't like the police officers of the Mayfield Police Department were experienced in solving murders, because they just didn't have to deal with many of them. So from the very beginning, they didn't properly canvass the scene. They didn't know what evidence to keep, what things to throw out. They, for example, found maggots on Jessica's body, and they chose to throw them out. And what we know now is that those maggots perhaps could have helped tell what day Jessica was killed. And I think the thing to point out is that the detectives did say they were inexperienced. They did tell their higher-ups that they didn't really know what they were doing, and they didn't appear to get much help. And eventually the Kentucky State Police had to step in, and then the Kentucky Attorney General's office had to step in. So it's just failure after failure after failure.
Maggie, tell me about Mayfield, Kentucky, because it kind of is important to the story, right? I mean, what kind of a town it was, who lived there, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, so Mayfield, even then, is very, very small. I mean, now there's really nothing there because this tornado went through in the recent years and really decimated the whole town, including the courthouse, which had a lot of the evidence in this case. So, Mayfield's pretty segregated, small town. It's really one of those, you cross the tracks and there's kind of a nice neighborhood and there's a not so nice neighborhood. And the night Jessica was walking through town, she started off kind of on the other side of the tracks, which is one of the things that I really noticed going there multiple times. It's a really rural, southern type town. So, one of the things that really stood out to us about Mayfield and about Jessica and her father is that, he grew up in Mayfield, one of the only Black folks doing what he was doing. He joined the fire department. He did all these amazing things, fought for civil rights. And so when his daughter turns up dead and he's this community pillar, he expects the town to show up for him. And, as we know, that's not what happened. And what we found is that it's a lot like many small towns. There's people know each other, and there's a lot of secrets, and there's a lot of corruption that go on.
In the initial aftermath of finding her body, what's sort of the first little while of the investigation and who they think might have been behind this?
They determined early on that there was a struggle at the middle school, which is where they found her body. She appears to have been bludgeoned. She was beaten. Her nose was broken. And they found her with her underwear lying next to her. And they don't necessarily know what that means. They don't know if that means there was a sexual assault, but, it's in the air. And then her body was burned. She wasn't burned alive. Her body was burned post-mortem. But what they do know is that everything must have occurred around the middle school. But as hopefully listeners will find in the podcast, that isn't the theory that the prosecution ends up using to convict five
Not even
people
close.
down the road. Not even close. And I mean, there were rumors going around, again, not the ones the prosecution ends up using to convict the people, including one man who's currently still serving life in prison, Quincy Cross. But they thought maybe it was an angry boyfriend, maybe it was an angry friend. The rumor mill just started churning. I mean, there were names galore. Could it have been these people? Could it have been the cops? Could it have been the boyfriend, the friend? And I really think that influenced the initial investigation when you're having so many people come to you and just share their rumors.
Maggie, they do arrest somebody, and you did mention it earlier on that it fell apart, but who's the first person they arrest?
So they first arrest the father of Jessica's child. They were never dating, and Jeremy knew she was pregnant. There was a DNA test. It is his child, and they originally arrest him. And this story comes from this young girl around town who says she overhears Jeremy and this other boy, who actually was Jessica's boyfriend, Lolo, saying, "We got her good," or "We'll get that bitch good." And that is how everything gets kicked off with the arrest of Jeremy and Lolo.
But that case falls apart. Rebecca, can you tell us why that does end up not being the person who's currently in prison for killing her?
I mean, what we could find on the record was basically the prosecution failed to hand over at least around 20 audio and videotapes that could have been potentially exculpatory, right? That the Jeremy Adams and Carlos Saxton's attorneys thought that could have evidence pointing towards their innocence. And the prosecution not only doesn't hand them over, they never find them. They say they've
What are
completely
the
disappeared.
audio tapes of?
We don't know. We don't know
know.
because they're gone. We asked for them. They disappeared.
Wow.
Along with other evidence in this case that should exist.
But when the judge at the time throws out the case, he says he'd never seen something so terribly handled. And he basically yells at the prosecution to get their act in order. But he dismisses the case without prejudice, which means the prosecution could have brought a case again, but they don't. And eventually the theory moves from these people who were originally charged to the people who were eventually tried and convicted for Jessica's murder.
And that's when this Susan Galbreath kind of comes into the picture. So Maggie, can you tell me who Susan is?
So Susan is a local housewife, homemaker. She was pretty much bored. And when she finds out about Jessica's murder, she actually shows up at the crime scene. And so she's always had this interest in it. Fast forward a few years later to around 2004. Now that this case is dropped between Jeremy and Lolo, she thinks, I'm going to find out who did this now. So Susan gets involved. And what we discover is that she really steers this entire investigation. The police, the state police and the KBI don't just get some tips from her and look into it and move on. She really is leading this investigation, doing, her own citizen wiring, talking to people under false pretenses, doing a lot of things that for a civilian, the police probably should not have been engaging with.
How?
Well, I mean,
He's a civilian. I was like, what?
It's interesting because, we're looking at it from this like 2025 citizen sleuth, Reddit kind of perspective, but that didn't exist in '04. So, it kind of was in my head to the credit of the police, I guess. They weren't aware of how these things could really go wrong, I'd say, and thought she was an honest woman, I think is the best I could say.
But Rebecca, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going to stick to this for a second, but I have never heard of homicide detectives or regular detectives or beat cops allowing a civilian to become engaged in an investigation.
Yes, and what we found was that there was a push and pull, right? Like Susan, because we were able to get a lot of the tape from their phone calls, Susan would call and pester them, and they would kind of push her away, but then they would bring her back. And her relationship with police changed throughout the years, right? She had a maybe frosty, sometimes warm relationship with the state police, but once the Kentucky Attorney General's office came in, we don't necessarily have phone calls between them, but we know that these agents of the state with the Kentucky State Attorney General's office just ran on her tips and use her scenarios of the crime to eventually charge and prosecute these people. And we don't know. Now, I do want to put something into context, though, is that you're talking about a crime, one of the only murders of Mayfield in years, and it went unsolved for 4 or 5 years. So people were desperate. And we don't necessarily include this in podcasts, but Joe Currin, Jessica Currin's father, the victim's father, was at the time happy that someone else was stepping in to help and maybe chasing some leads. So I think when we look back, we think this is wild, but I have to believe that at the moment, people were desperate for answers. And here comes someone who very confidently says, I think I found the answer.
And this is all would not actually be possible if it weren't for the help of a BBC journalist. She wasn't just a housewife. She was being legitimized by a very high-profile investigative BBC war correspondent who came into little Mayfield and was just enamored with this woman. And I think, based on emails we have read and quotes he said, I'm going to make you famous yet. And I think there was a twofold situation. He had a good story. We're still here. It's a great story. But I think she was legitimized in ways she shouldn't have been. And that was the police and the journalist. His name is Tom Mangold.
Okay. I want to ask how they got there, but I also want to know what they say kind of happened. Because like you told us a minute ago, it looked as though the crime scene was at the middle school, but they placed it somewhere else.
Susan and Tom, based on their emails, we could tell they pick up on the fact that Jessica's underwear was found removed and nearby her body. There is no rape, no sexual assault, nothing mentioned. There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of this on Jessica's body. But they find this underwear and they key in on that and go, there was probably a sexual assault here. And that's the moment that the KBI, the Kentucky Attorney General's officers, start spiraling with this sexual assault. And that's how we get this crazy drug-fueled Quincy Cross orgy.
Yeah, I mean, the theory they end up going with is that Quincy Cross, who was a man in his early 20s, a person with a record, I think that's something worth mentioning as well. A lot of people in small town Mayfield and neighboring Kentucky are people who have a lot of encounters with the law. A lot of people caught selling drugs, including Quincy Cross. So these are people who are known in the system. And they find the name of Quincy Cross in documents because Quincy Cross was actually visiting Mayfield, Kentucky when the night that Jessica was killed. And he, alongside many other people, were arrested for drugs that evening. So they find the name of this out-of-towner, this guy. They heard partygoers in the party that he was at saying that he was behaving kind of weird, kind of rowdy, talking about wanting girls. And most importantly, and something we haven't mentioned, is he was wearing this braided belt. Now, for those millennials out there, this is the typical leather braided belt that everyone was wearing in the early 2000s. He was wearing that. And what we know now is that in the crime scene, there was the fragment of a charred leather belt, woven belt, found alongside Jessica Currin. Again, when police first saw this, they were like, could it be that a belt had strangled her? We don't know. Perhaps it was blunt force trauma. We don't know. But Susan and Tom put the dots together. They're like, this out-of-towner who was rowdy, who was talking about trying to find girls. And he was wearing this belt that everyone saw him kind of swinging around like a lasso. And we haven't found the killer, so clearly it was this guy. And because he was rowdy, because he was picked up for drugs, they say, oh, clearly this is a deviant who... And this is where it gets crazy. And if you don't understand it, neither do we necessarily. Clearly, this deviant convinced 4 other locals to pick up Jessica Currin, to beat her, to torture her, to rape her in a drug-fueled craze, then to keep her body and dispose it a few days later and burn it.
And again, the part that I mentioned, the drug-fueled sex thing, comes in once they realize the underwear. So it's just Tom and Susan just like picking up on these things and creating these stories.
And as you said, Kathleen, they changed the crime scene. You didn't have the evidence for this wild 5-people attack, at the middle school. It was just, it looked like there was a scuffle, but there wasn't DNA all over of some sort of, orgy.
Orgy can be fun. This sounded horrible.
It was horrible, a terrible attack.
A terrible attack, and including, and we'll get into the other people, but like attacking her after she had died. It was really, really shocking.
No, it's a very disturbing tale. And obviously, this could not have happened in the middle school, so they had to change the crime scene. And I say, based on the evidence we have found, it seems like they changed the crime scene to the house of one of the locals, a kid named Jeff Burton, who ends up being convicted for this crime. But yeah, it just seemed like as the years passed, they developed a theory of the crime, and then they just needed to fit all the other pieces to fit that theory. And listen, citizen sleuths and journalists are allowed to have theories. But the reason we're here and the reason we made a podcast about it was because the prosecution ended up using these theories to convict people.
You guys did such a nice job. Like, your first episode sort of sets it up with the evidence, quote unquote, evidence used to put Quincy there. And then you kind of back it up and you're like, sure, all of these things sound terrible, but there's no proof that any of this happened. Part of what in your first episode, and as you go forward a bit, is the evidence of one woman, Victoria. Can you, Maggie or Rebecca, tell me about her and how she got involved and what she says happened that night?
So Victoria's really the first witness we know that's involved. She was 15, super, super young. She comes forward and says she hears Jeremy Adams and Lolo talking about having killed Jessica or being involved. That's really the last we hear of her until Susan Galbreath gets involved. By the time Susan is in touch with Victoria, she's clued the KBI into Victoria. She has said, I believe this girl is a key witness. Now, Victoria really is the center of the story because she wraps everyone else up. So she involves her cousin Tamara Caldwell, who dated Quincy back in the day. And that is one of the ways we do also believe Quincy kind of got involved. We discover Victoria might have had a vendetta against her cousin and was like, oh, I could throw her name in. And she dated that guy Quincy. So, Victoria's really interesting because she was also sent away to be put in witness protection a couple times by the police. So she was always very close to the police. And we believe that so her story would stay the same because it was so weak. And she has now come forward and said, that was all a lie and made it all up. And one of the only pieces of evidence that they have is a diary that she now says she faked. She said, I never wrote that in 2000. It was written whenever they picked me up in 2006, 7.
The diary is like, at the time it was taken as evidence that the night of the murder, she wrote about it in her diary.
Allegedly, she wrote in this diary, all about this murder. And when I say all about, it's like a page each just going, oh crap, they're going to get us. And it's a few pages like that. And that was submitted as evidence. So Victoria is key. And to this day, the KVI is still in touch with her. When some of our investigators, one of the attorneys showed up at her house to talk to her, she said, I was just called and told not to talk about this case. So she's really key in everything.
And very unreliable.
Incredibly unreliable. I mean, one of the first things we picked up on in this story is it surrounds a bunch of very vulnerable characters, particularly young women. Again, at the time of this murder, Victoria was 15. Whether she was involved or not, she's 15 years old. She's a child.
Who else then got caught up and charged with the murder?
Yeah. So just to recap, we have Quincy Cross, who's currently serving a life sentence for this murder. Then we have Jeff Burton, Tamara Caldwell. We have Victoria Caldwell, who we describe as the state's key witness and a witness to the crime, an accomplice to the crime, according to the prosecution. And we have Venetia Stubblefield, who was the last known person to see Jessica Currin alive. She was an acquaintance of Jessica's, a new friend. And Jessica that night was hanging out with Venetia and a few other girlfriends. And around 2 a.m., Jessica decides to go home. They can't find her a ride, even though they try. And Venetia walks her out and she says goodbye and she watches her walk into the night. And that is the account that Venetia Stubblefield gave authorities for several years, really. And once Victoria Caldwell came into the scene, those accounts started changing. And the truth is, we have so many versions of this story. We have so many versions of what happened. At least 3 or 4 different versions from Venetia, at least 4 or 5 different versions from Victoria.
Venetia, just really quick. I mean, that one I remember very vividly watching her interviews because we have like a bunch of back-to-back interviews with her. I think even maybe 6. And
interviews with the police.
Yeah.
Coming back to her again and again. Tell us this again. Tell us this again. And every time she told it, it was just significantly different. It wasn't like, oh, we were standing here and then here. It was, I don't remember if we hit her with a bat or if someone carried her or dragged her or if she walked. So you can watch that in Venetia's interviews specifically, how much her story changed over the years.
And I want to be fair. People's stories change. People's memories falter, right? Like it's very hard to get people's accounts of things. But if you're using that story or those stories to then convict people of murder, you got to say, are these stories dependable? Are these witnesses dependable? And what we found is they weren't.
Maggie, did you guys find anything that ties Quincy to the murder?
Absolutely not. We found nothing.
No DNA, no.
There is no DNA in this case that was ever even presented at trial. Now his attorneys are trying to test some things that were never tested. Again, there was a tornado that ripped through the town a few years ago and destroyed the courthouse where a lot of that evidence was being stored. So there was no DNA linking Quincy. DNA results did come back. Again, they do not link any of these people to any of this. The belts that the prosecution used to specifically convict him, that's what you heard about the whole trial. There was no evidence in any sort of way that's his belt at all. No DNA. Could have been anyone's belt. At trial, we heard testimony from someone saying, yeah, I'm wearing that same belt right now. It was the most common belt you could find in the 2000s. So no, we didn't find any evidence linking a single one of these people to the murder.
There was gas, right? So that was one thing. There was gas found on him. And then because her body was burned, there was a belief that that was part of it. Can you tell me what the story is that, is evidence again, and then what he tells you had actually happened?
The timeline that we found is Quincy leaves this gathering, and he either wants to go find girls or get food. 20-something years ago, the story's very vague. So Quincy leaves, and his story is that the car breaks down. And next thing we do know, we have a police report of a state trooper coming by and saying, we saw this man, the car is broken down. He was pouring gas in the car. Quincy gets gas on his pants, but in the report, it says this man smells like gas. So this is when we believe Susan Galbreath really honed in on this gas situation. Now, nothing is noted of that night. No one knows Jessica's dead that night, so it's just found this guy pouring gas in his car, end of story. A few days later, Jessica's found, and again, Quincy's name doesn't come up until years later when Susan sees this police report and goes, gas. But there's a really big problem with that because the original story is that Jessica is burned. Quincy's there. They all burn this body. Quincy was arrested that night of the police report, that night of the party. He was in prison for almost a year afterwards, was not released. So how would he have been burning this body during this time? The prosecution said he was. But eventually, the prosecution had to add in 2 more people to this story to make this burning of the body actually work.
So this link of Quincy Cross smelling like gasoline and that implying that he burned her body doesn't even make sense with the timeline.
Right,
Now,
he smelled on Sunday and she's burned on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I want to be really clear. They presented this at trial. This is at trial. They say gas, man, belt, and they kind of just throw the words at you, right? And I think one of the things we found for people who haven't had the chance of sitting through a long trial like that is it's just long. There's so much information. Even writing this podcast, there was so much to go through that if you can just remember key words, right? Man, girls, belt, gas, that they hoped was enough for the jurors to at least relate, Quincy to this killing. And ultimately they did.
Where was the defense?
Maggie, I mean, he had an uphill battle, right?
So that's what I was going to say. In fairness to him, I know Quincy says he didn't have a great attorney, and sure, there were probably things he should have fought, but it really was an uphill battle. I mean, if you watch from the beginning, and that was one of the beautiful things actually about this case, is not only do we have journalists' emails, but we have the whole thing recorded from the very beginning, all of the pretrial motions, and sitting there and listening to that is really when we got a sense of what the defense was up against, the amount of, documents of 3 different investigations over the course of, 8-9 years. They said, it was a quote, this is either death by 1,000 cuts or Chinese water torture. Not my words, his. But that's how he felt. It was torture to go through all of this. Evidence was hidden from him. Things were buried. There's 5, 6, 7. Eventually, there were 9 people caught up in this case. There was a lot for this defense attorney to deal with. And it's interesting because beforehand, too, you can hear a couple of the attorneys actually telling the judge, I think Tamara's was one of them specifically saying, Judge, I don't think my client was involved in this. Like, there's something really wrong here. And Quincy's attorney did try to flag that. I mean, these attorneys, for the 5 of them, were really trying to flag there's something really wrong here.
So Susan Galbreath says that this was because God told her to do it. But there was something else driving her. And it kind of broke my heart a little bit. Why was Susan doing this that you guys could figure out?
And Rebecca, you have a softer spot for Susan, I feel like. You can.
Well,
I don't. It didn't break my heart for Susan. It broke my heart for Quincy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have much of a soft spot for Susan, I have to tell you.
I mean, this was always the back and
The whole
forth.
thing broke my heart.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the deal. I will say, when she says soft spot for Susan, this was a person who, admittedly, she is on the record. She has since died. She died around 2018, I believe. But she's on the record saying that she just did not have a lot going on for her at that time in her life. Family members had died. She'd lost her job. She was on her 3rd or 4th marriage to a man who drank too much. So I do believe part of it. I do believe there is some truth to the fact that when she found this case, heard about this case, and was urged by God to go to the crime scene, I do believe this was a woman who had found some sort of meaning and who felt very important. I mean, she got awarded Citizen of the
Mhm.
Year by the Kentucky Attorney General's office, right? Like, this was a big deal. But this woman also was friends, though she denies it. But according to the documents we found, she was at least close to the mother of Jeremy Adams, who was the first person charged with this murder, the father of Jessica Currin's baby. And Jeremy Adams' mom, who is also deceased, was under the impression that Susan was going to help get her son out of jail, or at least get these charges dropped and just move on to some sort of other suspect. I don't know what motives she had, but what we can see is that around that time when journalist Tom Mangold comes and reports on Mayfield, he does a couple articles, he dismisses Jeremy Adams immediately. He says, this boy was charged, but clearly they didn't have enough to charge him. However, this man, Quincy Cross, this like seriously nasty drug dealer, Quincy Cross, we should be looking at him, without really saying that the amount of evidence they had against Jeremy Adams was kind of similar to what they had against Quincy, which was not that much. And we have to be fair to Jeremy as well. There wasn't that much physical evidence linking him to him. So the case that a lot of people have made to us and that I believe we present in the podcast is that Susan Galbreath wanted to help clear the name of the first person charged in this murder because she was her friend's son.
How did they deal with some of the information that came out? Like, you guys discovered that the Kentucky Bureau of Investigations was paying a lot of these witnesses quite a bit of money. Did they ever know that? Did they deal with it? Like, I'm curious how Tom, who's a journalist, apparently, managed to kind of deal with knowing that.
This wasn't really known at the time that Victoria was being paid the amount she was being paid.
How much did she get?
We found out in the end there was about $17,000 over that paid out to her. Certain things was for witness protection, made sense, housing, stuff like that. But then again, we found receipts for Claire's and girls' nights and margaritas and vibrators. So there was $17,000 over that of state money paid to this witness. While her co-defendant sat in jail. So Victoria was treated special. And one of the things is that, no, we don't believe Tom knew that. But what we can see in emails is that Susan's friend and other like citizen partner investigator was telling Tom, there's something not right here. So she started communicating with Tom and went out on her own and went to talk to Victoria, in which she comes back and says, Victoria says she made this all up and it's not true. So this was relayed back to Tom Mangold that Victoria has recanted. And yet, instead of making note of that in his following publication, or instead of, maybe questioning the story more so than writing a definitive article about this man, Quincy Cross, and this woman, Victoria Caldwell, that confessed to it, being factual, he didn't. He knew that what he was reporting was not 100% accurate.
I have to admit, I absolutely loved the communication with him.
Oh, you didn't even hear the full of it.
I can't.
Or the lawyers won't let it come out.
Yeah, we're not allowed to put in what he said. But
okay, once we're off, I want you to tell me. But so Susan is gone, but Tom is around and very storied through the BBC. He's got a great reputation. Tell me about how he handled hearing about your investigation.
Yeah, so we had sent him multiple emails from the beginning, actually like very friendly. Like we did not have intentions of, having a combative relationship or anything like that. We reached out very friendly, like, hey, we're reporting on this. You were the foremost journalist on it. Let's talk. Ignored it. I've heard from many people who have emailed him and he's responded in minutes. And somehow 3 emails, by the time I reached him on the phone, he had never seen a single one of them. So I call him and say, hey, this is who I am, whatever. We're looking to the story. He goes, no, I have no idea who you are. And I was like, well, I just put an email in your inbox. Like, it is right there if you want to check it. So he had to respond at that point. And he responds unbelievably patronizing and condescendingly. just saying, I suggest you do your research and look into this case. And, if you still think Quincy's innocent, that's your deal. And I said right back, I think that's absolutely patronizing and condescending of you to suggest I have not done my research. In fact, sir, your emails are part of my research. They are public record. And I suggest you read the case because I would really like to talk to you about just accountability and this story, still trying to just have a conversation about journalism because I have been there. I have gotten it wrong. And I made the effort to look back to make sure I didn't get it wrong again. And that's what Rebecca and I really want to talk to him about. We thought it would be fun. I really thought he'd maybe be open to like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. You guys picked up where I left off and found all these things. Hell yeah. And it was fully shut down. He called me a, quote, batty conspiracy theorist. And Quincy Cross, if you are on that innocent train, you're all crazy, basically.
Well, he did say that if our intention was to say anything other than Quincy Cross is guilty, then he had nothing to talk to us about.
He has nothing to say.
Rebecca, you mentioned, I think it was you or Maggie, I can't remember now, but you both speak from the same brain, I'm sure, by this point. So that the cop who took it on, the beat cop, felt that he was set up to fail. Are you suggesting in some way there was a conspiracy or something that somebody didn't want this case figured out? Like, what's that about?
I have to say, this has been a back and forth. Maggie and I co-wrote the show, and this was a back and forth, with how much to reveal, how much to say. And part of that, I just want to make very clear, we are calling out Tom Mangold for doing irresponsible reporting. And there's an acknowledgement in that the work we do as journalists is really important, even if we forget about it, right? I think Tom Mangold maybe forgot about this story. It had been decades, I think when we called him, he was just like, what are you talking about? I don't even know. But the words you put out there matter. And he singled out a few people in a way that had devastating effects for these people, right? So when we've heard the amount of rumors that we heard over this case, we really debated what rumors to put out there and which ones not to. But we do have this cop, Tim Fortner, the first detective on the scene in Jessica Currin's murder, saying, I was set up to fail. I mean, I wasn't given any help. And the chief of police at the time really, if he wanted this case solved, he really didn't act like it.
Yeah. So this podcast is through Lava for Good, which is from the Bone Valley Fantastic Podcast with Gilbert and Leo. And Leo, there was action that followed Bone Valley. Are you guys hoping you'll have the same effect on Quincy's life?
Yes. So right now, what we do know is he is going back to court on the 23rd. And so most of the evidence you hear in the podcast, they are presenting as new evidence. A lot of other things, like we just found out yesterday, another witness recanted. The cards are crumbling. And we do know that cards are starting to lay out a picture of police malfeasance. So his attorneys are moving forward with not only trying to release him from prison under, these Brady violations and the all of the wrongdoings, the Tom and the Susan leading the investigation. Big things are happening, but I don't see any world, if we're living in a sane world, where a judge will look at all of this evidence and say, no, this man still needs to be in prison. At minimum, he should have a new trial.
Well, you guys, congratulations. Like I said, it's a great doc. And to be able to affect change at some point in your life as journalists is like the top of the bar. So I hope it happens. And you must feel very proud of yourselves because it was a lovely work and a really good cause. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kathleen. We appreciate it. I'm so excited to be on the list, on the roster of people you've had on. You've had some great guests.
Yeah, we have.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. It was really nice to meet you.
Likewise.
Likewise.
Hey, I just wanted to pop in and say that since I spoke with Maggie and Rebecca, there have been some updates in this case. Quincy Cross was granted a new hearing, and now a judge will decide whether or not he gets a new trial or even possibly see his conviction overturned. During the hearing, multiple witnesses testified that they were pressured by law enforcement to change their story and implicate Cross. Some of the law enforcement officers involved in this case have denied those claims. And as of this recording, the hearing is ongoing. You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. You can hear the show ad-free by subscribing to CBC True Crime on Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow us there on Apple or on Spotify. You can also find us on YouTube, where we release video episodes every week. Just search and subscribe to CBC True Crime.